So, some economists are describing our current economic situation as a K shaped economy, where the top end of the economy is growing. Places like tech, finance, high income professionals, and asset owners are all doing really well. And the bottom end of the economy is declining. These are lower wage workers, people young in career, small business owners, and others who rely heavily on labor for their income. But fast forwarding to today, we see a lot of the same problems that we saw in the K shaped recovery from COVID continuing to rear their ugly head. We see stocks in the market continuing to gain investment, while seeing cracks in the market, hiring freezes, and folks being squeezed by inflation over the last couple of years. If you are on the bottom end of the economy, it's nearly impossible to get out of your situation at the moment. So, what does a K shaped economy mean for us? What has happened in history when we've seen this pattern before? And what tends to happen politically and socially when this occurs? For starters, yes, it's true that there's always splits in the economy, especially during recoveries. We see different sectors grow at different rates, depending on various factors of investment or changing needs and evolving technologies. However, usually the economy is moving in the same direction, like this, where the bottom end of the economy is growing, just more slowly. What's different with the K-shaped economy is that some areas are growing while others are still declining. We see this today as just a handful of companies are keeping the entire S&P 500 afloat. But what really worries me today is that this isn't just about these areas of the economy that are growing while others are stagnating. It's that these few successful companies are amplifying the turndown. We see companies like Amazon, one of the largest employers in the US, laying folks off and turning to new robotic technologies and AI to cover for those workers. That made up the bottom half of the economy. We see policy choices that favor tax cuts for the rich and corporations, while social safety nets are gutted. On top of that, recession packages, which would normally come out during a downturn, aren't coming out today, because many of the classic economic indicators are still showing the economy is strong. I could go on about how things like tariffs and other policies are continuing to amplify the downturn for the bottom half. But what I really want to talk about is that we clearly have a problem. Are in this K-shaped economy with policies and companies continuing to amplify the problem. So what happens next? Well, to answer that question, I want to take a look back at history to see where this type of unequal growth has happened before and how things have played out historically. I found three main examples. First, the Industrial Revolution in the 17 and 1800s. Factories, steam power, and global trade were all growing, and GDP was increasing rapidly. Owners of capital and skilled workers boomed, while folks who fled to cities to work found overcrowding, long hours, low pay, and health risks, all impacting the working class. The rich had rapid growth, while living conditions for workers lagged significantly. Second, America's Gilded Age. Post the Civil War and into the 1900s, we had rapid industrialization, which created massive fortunes for railroad, oil, and steel, while those industries paid low wages and workers lived in tenements and worked in unsafe conditions. And lastly, the Roaring Twenties. This one looks particularly familiar to today, as you had a rising stock market and consumer boom in cities, cars, radios, appliances all doing well to create a sense of modern prosperity. However, most families still fell below what was considered for the time as a basic decent income, as well as farmers getting hammered by low prices and taking on massive debt. The country felt rich, which was true in some aspects, and economic indicators showed that the economy was doing well, but a big chunk never experienced that roar. Again, one line goes up, while the other barely moves. So, in these examples, as the K begins to spread, what historically happens? I'd say, looking at all of these, three stages tend to happen. First is long-term fragility. This K-shaped economy can keep growing, becoming more and more fragile. Demand is weaker than the headline wealth might suggest, politics are more unpredictable, and big shocks can hit the downward part of the K much harder than the top, which obviously we see in the Great Depression following the Roaring Twenties. Second, patchwork fixes to this start popping up. So you'll start to see things like emergency relief, small regulatory tweaks, and targeted tax changes. Third and lastly, these movements tend to lead to political volatility. Both sides of the K start to feel pressure. The top feels under siege, being blamed for a lot of the economic issues, and the bottom feels ignored and is obviously under threat from economic issues. This often leads to populist movements and sharp swings from business-friendly to worker-friendly policies. We see this in the Industrial Revolution with the Great Reform Act of 1832, which gave more middle-class men in the UK the right to vote, and the push for labor rights, which eventually led to labor unions. We see transition from the Gilded Age of America to the Progressive Era, and from the 1920s into passing of the New Deal, leading to economic reform and a broader social safety net. So, to recap, looking back at history, we should expect to see a continued divide of the two halves of the K, followed by patchwork policy underneath the current systems. However, those usually not doing enough or going quickly enough, we will see a seismic shift in politics leading to greater reform. So, What does this mean for us today? And where do I see this going? Well, for starters, I think if we follow a similar path, I think today we're somewhere in that first stage of a growing K. We see glimpses of the other stages, but mainly we see demand slightly weaker than the headlines would suggest. Companies are taking on debt without much revenue. And we see political figures discussing patchwork fixes, but nothing clear yet that would show that we're really progressing forward. We're also seeing populist movements on the right, but very little that would show we're moving from a business-friendly to a worker-friendly environment. I think this puts us firmly in that first stage, which my main concern is how this time might be different. While I expect a similar path, I do think due to AI and robotic automation, this widening of the K will happen faster than we've seen historically. But I don't see policy changes happening faster than they have historically. Therefore, I worry that the K will get larger this time before eventually leading to stages 2 and 3. What will happen in the meantime before we get that policy change is really hard to predict, but I think the problems are clear. And the longer it takes for us to get to stages 2 and 3, the bigger the problems will be. Now is a good time to jump in. If you're enjoying this content, please give a like and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. So what are some other stories today? Across Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Malaysia, extreme flooding has killed over 1,000 people and displaced millions, with militaries deployed for evacuations and basic relief. Beyond this immediate tragedy is a bigger fight over climate liability. Poorer countries are getting hit really hard by climate change and are asking whether rich, high-emitting countries should help fund the rebuilding and adaptations. My guess is you'll hear a lot about this in the upcoming summits around climate change. On AI, there's now a tug-of-war between states and Congress. Attorneys generals from 35 states just sent a bipartisan letter telling lawmakers not to pass a federal AI law that would wipe out state regulations, warning of disastrous consequences that would happen if AI went unregulated. Given that all 50 states have introduced some AI bill this year, my guess is we'll continue with this patchwork system for a while, with baseline federal rules and states experimenting. We also have a listener question. Is the U.S. at war with Venezuela? The short answer is, of course, no, not in the formal sense. Congress hasn't approved war, and the administration is framing it as a counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism campaign against cartels and networks linked to Venezuela, plus economic sanctions to help restore democracy in Venezuela. So that's the official story: drugs, terrorism, and democracy. But if you look at incentives, there seem to be a few deeper motives here. This is much a do-over for Trump from his first term. Trump's first massive pressure campaign against Venezuela did a lot to hurt Venezuelan economy, but didn't do a ton to actually remove Maduro from office. This round seems like an attempt to finish that job, but going harder, with military deployments, terrorist labels, and ultimatums. Trump thinks he can get a win here by forcing Maduro out. There's also, of course, oil. Venezuela has one of the world's largest proven oil reserves, even if production is low right now. A post-Maduro government that's more friendly to Washington, with carefully tailored sanction reliefs, would give the U.S. more influence over that oil. Another piece here is, of course, migration. Venezuela's collapse has forced many to leave. Cracking down on Maduro allows Trump to say that his hardline border policies are more about fixing the problem from the source itself, even as he'll likely use the crisis to justify more enforcement at home. Lastly, Venezuela partners in trade with Russia, China, and Iran. Doing this all hurts those countries without direct conflict and keeps the U.S. in better control of the Western Hemisphere. So, are there real drug flows from Venezuela? Yes, but the deadliest drug in the U.S. right now is fentanyl, which is mostly produced in Mexico and smuggled by land. And heavy naval deployments and aircraft carriers are not the most efficient ways to chase drug boats. So, with everything combined, it's reasonable to think drugs are the legal and moral wrapper here, but not the whole story. It's more likely policy, oil, and military related. And that's what I got for you today, December 2nd, 2025, or known as the 35th anniversary of the Space Shuttle Columbia, launching the STS-35 mission, carrying Astro 1, a dedicated space lab packed with telescopes that could see the universe in ultraviolet and X-ray light. In just 9 days, it helped kill a dark matter theory, strengthened the case for giant black holes and galactic centers, solved part of a galaxy mystery around ultraviolet light, confirmed a hot halo around the Milky Way, and forced astronomers to rewrite pieces of their models for exploding stars and interstellar dust.